Hello, my name is Richard Haight, and today I'd like to discuss the concept of spirituality, what I mean when I use that word, and how it relates to what I describe as spiritual unfoldment and spiritual awakening. And I'm going to have to delineate between spiritual unfoldment, spiritual awakening, philosophy, and psychology. And at some point, I imagine as the human being's awareness unfolds still further, the differences between philosophy, psychology, and spiritual awakening will begin to diminish more and more. But at this point, because of the intentional direction and certain assumptions and biases within these fields, and certain lack of awarenesses, there becomes a divergence, an unavoidable divergence. And it's very important that we who are walking the spiritual awakening path are aware of the divergent points, because if we're not aware of these differences, it can be very easy to be confused and get lost on the path. And since your time on this earth is precious, every moment we want to make the use of it as much as possible. We can save ourselves a lot of time and suffering by simply being aware of the differences between these models of awakening. A psychology could be a model of awakening. Philosophy could be a model of awakening. But it's a different model than what I describe as spiritual unfoldment. So first and foremost is, what do I mean when I use the term spirituality? This is a very, very deep question that could probably be discussed for days or weeks or years. But I want to try and make it as simple as possible and go over the greater depth of it over a period of videos so that you can see and mature into that deeper understanding over time. What I mean by spirituality is, I don't mean anything special when I use the term spirituality. I don't mean the mundane, nor do I mean the completely abstract or that which is beyond the physical. I mean the totality. I mean that which is and that which is not, that is, that which is being and that which is beyond being. And it is all inclusive, which means it includes you. It includes me. It includes all that is, all that ever was, all that ever will be. All of that is what I describe as spiritual. A oneness, an interconnectedness, and a fundamental indivisibility. And so from that perspective, I'm not excluding or referring to some sort of specific psychic phenomenon or mystical phenomenon, although it could potentially include those. I mean, it includes those things potentially, but it's not exclusive to those things. And that isn't the point of spiritual awakening. There's nothing that you could ever do that will make you any more spiritual than you already are. There's nothing that you could ever do that will make you any less spiritual than you already are. And this simple point is the source, the misunderstanding of this point is the source of a great deal of suffering for people who self-identify, who say, I am a spiritual person. It's a redundant statement, I am a spiritual person, or I'm a very spiritual person, I'm a highly spiritual person, all of that. First of all, that's a very egoic statement, and it's an attempt to make yourself feel special. You raise yourself up relative to others who are less spiritual than you. That is actually an effect of being spiritually asleep. It is an effect of being unaware of the interconnection of all it is, and that fundamentally it's impossible to be any more or less spiritual than one already is. So to say I am more spiritual or I'm very spiritual or any of that kind of stuff is revealing the fact that you are actually unaware of the interconnection of all things. and that you've created a mental hierarchy with yourself being high on that hierarchy and others being below. That kind of mentality is not what I mean by spirituality or spiritual awakening. I don't care if you have grand visions and you see the future, or you've spoken with the Buddha in the spiritual dimension, or Christ, or all of that stuff. You don't get any extra credit spirit points for that. I've had a great number of visions in my life from childhood on. I don't get any extra credit points for that. I'm no more spiritual than anybody else. And so that's the first point. You come at it from it's not a humble perspective, it's just an honest perspective. So we're not trying to be humble. It's not like I'm saying, oh, I've had all these mystical experiences and I have this understanding, and then I'm creating a false humility by saying, but I'm not any more special than anybody else. No, this is just as honest as you can be, seeing the totality. You must admit that there's nothing that you could ever do or ever not do that will change the degree of your interconnection with all that is. And so that's what I mean by spirituality. And if you can catch and really observe your mind in the process of spiritual awakening, you may notice that there are times when you're inclined to say, I am a spiritual person, or I'm a very spiritual person, or oppositely, I'm not, or I'm less spiritual, or this person is more spiritual than I am. All of that stuff is a lie. It's all a lie. It doesn't matter if it seems humble or not humble. That's all the stuff of ego. It's all confusion. And so let's, little by little, set that aside. To say that it won't happen, that these thoughts won't arise within, would be false. Because if that's the pattern, it is going to repeat. It's just that when awakening to that is the point. One awakens to the fact that these thoughts are arising. And that is what I mean by spiritual awakening. One awakens to the disharmony that arises within. Now, in order to awaken to that disharmony and not create more disharmony or more suffering in the process, we must not blame what arises within. We just see it for what it is, recognize, that is not true. That is a lie. It's hard to say what is true. I mean, truth, to say that we understand the totality, it's just beyond the capacity of the mind to define and to extrapolate upon. And so just to say that or even think that is inherently a lie. Whether we're recognizing that point, it's a false statement, whether we recognize it or not. So we can't really say what truth is per se, although it can be experienced. We just can't limit it with words. We can be aware of what is disharmonious or really out of touch with that greater truth. What brings suffering? What is a lie? What is a direct falsehood that leads to more suffering? And so the awakening process is the human mechanism awakening, whatever the human mechanism is. I'm not saying I know what it is. Awakening to the falsehoods and false projections, the disharmonious projections, the suffering that is arising into the window of perception that we have, and into and expressing through the body into the world. And that awakening is essential and important. So that's what I mean by spiritual awakening. And in that sense, spiritual awakening is not philosophy. Spiritual awakening is awareness. I can't say that it's the same thing as intelligence or IQ, although there may be some amount of intelligence or IQ necessary for this. I don't think it really requires that much. It requires awareness. It's the kind of awareness that it's feeling-based awareness. I don't mean emotions there. I mean feeling-based awareness. If you go out to the forest and you watch a cougar, in that playground, in the forest playground, the cougar is far more aware than the vast majority of humans could ever be. The human playground is, of course, the external playground, but also the playground of the mind. And that is where the human awareness has its real niche. And so for that is the main area through which the awakening process occurs. The cougar doesn't necessarily have that window of internal awareness where there is the voice that says, I am me. And then the abstract thinking that can extrapolate from the statements, I am me and that is other. Human beings have that playground. And so the spiritual awakening process is becoming aware of that playground and who is playing and what is playing within that playground. By who and what I mean, what I'm referring to there is the thoughts and emotions that arise. Those are the children in the playground. We need to be aware of, we become increasingly more aware of those things in the process of spiritual awakening. Now, one can call this mindfulness. I haven't any particular issue with that, although I don't specifically mean what is typically taught as mindfulness when I'm referring to this. Because in order for mindfulness to truly come into its place in the spiritual awakening process, it requires some sort of peak experience where one has actually directly experienced consciousness, unconditioned awareness. And I don't mean that you're now suddenly aware of what some Chinese man is thinking on the opposite side of the planet. I don't mean that. I mean an unconditioned feeling, which is the feeling that your body, that awareness doesn't stop at the body. It extends in every direction. Being doesn't stop at the body, but it extends in every direction. It's everywhere simultaneously. And once there is that awareness, mindfulness really comes into its place, because then it becomes obvious which thoughts are out of context with the totality, and to what degree they're out of context with the totality, to what degree they cause suffering within and project that suffering into the world. So that's what I mean by spiritual awareness, spiritual awakening. It's awakening to the suffering that's caused by the habitual mental patterns, mental emotional patterns that arise through the nervous system into the window of perception, which people think of being as themselves. Philosophy is an attempt to equate what reality is and then apply specific strategies to what the perception of reality is. So it is an attempt to define all that is and then delineate it so that we can have function in the world that is that causes less suffering. So in that sense, the intent is not necessarily disharmonious, but it is not based on awareness within the body. It's based on awareness out there, and maybe based on awareness of thinking. But it's an attempt to create a box through which the world should be perceived. That is philosophy, which is why it always breaks down. There is a point there's a limit to where one can go with philosophy for that very reason. And that's one of the reasons why people all in all, people are not inspired by it. Change in the world doesn't typically happen by philosophy. In other words, if you argue philosophically about a certain point, that doesn't usually make much change in other people. They're much more inclined to just go with what they feel and what their emotions are. And that's a limitation of philosophy, because it's sort of disembodied. It's disembodied, whereas spiritual awakening is fully embodied. It's fully embodied, and that awareness extends from the very core of whatever this is to the entirety. That's the perception. I'm not saying it's better than philosophy. It's just a different animal. It's a different approach. It's a different awareness. It's not knowledge-based specifically. It's awareness-based first. There are some knowledge level aspects of spiritual awakening, which I will get into in a future video. I'll talk about that knowledge, the basic knowledge that's required to walk this path. And it's pretty basic and subtle stuff, but it's actually, because of its subtlety, it's challenging. It's a different perception, a different perspective on everything. And because of that subtlety, it's challenging. It's not inherently difficult material. It's just so different from the way that we normally would perceive or habitually perceive the world, that it is oftentimes elusive to the mind. And that's all right. That's just part of the process. When one plays with these awarenesses and becomes familiar with them and starts to really see how it works, then it starts to become more and more obvious. That's just a part of the awakening process. So that brings us to what I refer to as spiritual unfoldment. This is a term that I have inherited from one of my early mentors. He used the term spiritual unfoldment. I liked it. Actually, I might have got it back from when I was studying a kind of religious system called eschatology. I think they use the same term, unfoldment. But in any case, the idea of unfoldment, I like the idea of unfoldment because it's very easy to visualize, and it very well represents what's, as a model, what is occurring within the human being through the awakening process. So the first awakening is simply the awakening to the fact that I don't want to continue living the way I'm living. There's got to be more. I just can't continue this way. So that's the first awakening. It's the awakening from the fact that you're suffering so much that you don't want to continue suffering that way, and that you're now open to a new perspective. That's the first awakening. So that is the very first step one takes on the awakening path. Now, whether one diverges or stays on the awakening path from there remains to be seen, and is up to the degree in which the individual is willing to walk that path with integrity. The actual path itself is well symbolized by the unfoldment process. What I describe as unfoldment is, imagine there's a piece of paper laid out in front of you, and on that piece of paper, the very center of that piece of paper that's uncreased, is the secret of is the fundamental harmony that is. The fundamental harmony that is. And when that paper is open, one can see it and partake and experience that harmony readily. However, as soon as one tries to understand that harmony and tries to define that harmony, it's a mental activity that's intended to box or grasp that harmony. And what that does is it's like folding that paper in half. Now, whatever was written there that inferred harmony is no longer visible. And so then now one may remember the content of whatever it was that inferred harmony, and think about it more, which is really the attempt to define harmony is the attempt to define self. What ends up happening is it folds a paper then again. And each time that we fold a paper, it creates a little more of a sense of insecurity, a little more of a sense of separation. Even though that the content of harmony, whatever that was that inferred harmony, is no further away from us than it was before. The paper's right there, it's just folded. It just can't be perceived anymore. It's still the same paper, it's just as far from us as it ever was. It's right there, it's within our grasp. It's never separate from us. We can't perceive that harmony anymore. So we think more, trying to get back to it, and fold again, and fold again, and fold again, and it keeps folding. And with each fold, it's easier to make the next fold. And there becomes a desperation to understand the world, to create a sense of security. And in the attempt to create a sense of security and understand the world, those folds pile up, and it becomes this mass that is the effective result. The effective result of that mass is what you perceive to be you, the self. The very way that you perceive the world. Now, I don't want to say that the self is wrong, and I don't want to say that the self is entirely unnecessary. It's the individual. Let's look at it almost like from an animal's perspective. So the animal has awareness of the environment in which it's in, and instincts are moving it throughout that environment, and it has goals and to a minimal degree, and it has a sensory sense of self, and it does have thoughts and feelings. It's just not abstract thoughts and feelings about the self that you or I would have, like I'm a doctor or that sort of thing. The next level of evolution or awareness would be something like a human being that is then able to look in the mirror and recognize I am me, and able to say that and create abstract thoughts based off of I am me. And that's all this folding. So the first enlightenment is just the awareness of I am me. That's like turning a light on and going, I know what this is. Of course, with that awareness, there is the first fold. Because it's assuming that you could ever understand what this is. And those folds just multiply from there. At the next step is the awareness that those folds that were created are actually now blocking perception or veiling perception from that fundamental awareness that's at the very base of all that is. It's created a sense of separation. So no matter how many people you know, no matter how popular you are, no matter how much money you have, there is still this underlying sense of meaninglessness or lack of fulfillment in quiet times, or even in a crowded room or in an overcrowded world. There is this sense of loneliness and separation. And our lives are an attempt to try and fill this hole of disconnection. So that awareness that the sense of self has created this massive distancing, a psychological distancing from that fundamental awareness or harmony that is at the base of all things, and that all things ultimately are actually derived from. That all things are derived from. There's nothing that doesn't come from that. All these folds are just misunderstandings of harmony. Evil is not the opposite of harmony. Knowledge is not the opposite of harmony. The self is not the opposite of harmony. They're all based off of misunderstandings of harmony. There is no opposite of harmony. There's nothing that exists outside of harmony. So again, back to that. The first, that awakening is awakening to the fact that the self that has been unconsciously developed is causing suffering. The next level of awakening is awakening to how that disharmony, how those thoughts arise within the body into the perceptive window. And then the releasing of the energy that's built up in those thoughts and emotions is what I call unfoldment. As one releases that bound up energy in the body, it's like unfolding that paper. Now, ultimately, we need to be unfolding more than we're folding. And that's the awakening path. Psychology. Psychology is as it currently is an attempt, generally speaking, to define what it is that the human being is and how the human being functions. And through understanding what the human being is and how it functions, you're able to understand what it is that causes dysfunction within the human being. It's based on models. There are some very, very beneficial aspects of psychology. But as psychology as it is right now has limitation. Of course it has limitation. Because psychology is measuring health based off of what is normal. And what is normal is just based off of the average person. If the average person is actually unhealthy, then psychology will take you, who is more unhealthy, and maybe make you a little less unhealthy so that you're equal to the average person. Because psychology is measuring health based on the norm. And so it becomes a kind of comparative aspect. I suspect that there are probably many branches and offshoots of psychology that may or may not do that. But it's just important to recognize what is What is it that one is moving toward? Now, if one is moving ever progressively towards less suffering, ever progressively towards awareness of harmony and releasing of that which creates disharmony, that might be the ultimate psychology. Psychology originally, the term psyche is the soul. So the study of the soul. So maybe what I'm doing in psychology ultimately are not, at some point I believe they will come back together. But that's not necessarily where it's at. I suspect if you were to look at forms of psychology, the thing that's probably closest to what I do, based on what I've heard from people that I've mentored, is Carl Jung's work. I actually purchased one of his books. I haven't read it yet, but at some point I will get to that, and maybe we can have a discussion of what Jung is pointing to in psychology. But again, what we're working with here is direct awareness within the body and how the things that arise within the body express out into the world. And it's essential that we recognize that the things that arise within this body are fundamentally not different than the things that arise in other bodies. Which is to say, the thoughts that arise in your body, in your mind, are not yours. The feelings that arise in your mind and your body are not yours. There's no need to own them. There's no need to believe that that is you. And that's a great place to end this. Play with those concepts. If you ever have any questions, you can contact me at contact@richardhaight, HAIGHT.net. If you have any questions that pertain to the greater community regarding the awakening process, I may be able to make a video on it. Just send me your questions. Please include the motivations for your questions. And I don't do spiritual trivia. I'm not interested in that sort of thing at all. How many angels are on the tip of a needle or any of that stuff. So this isn't about how much you know or how much I know. It's just an exploration of what it is to be. And in the increasing the awareness of what it is to be and to express in the world, that is spiritual awakening, that is spiritual unfoldment. If you would like to participate in what I will call the public mentoring, go ahead and you can email me and we can have a discussion through YouTube or whatever video format we end up using. It'll be live that everybody can see it, and that's free of charge. It's just be a fun thing to do, that you can gain benefit, that I can gain benefit, and that other people can gain benefit from. Go ahead and click subscribe at the bottom of the YouTube page or whatever video page we're doing. I don't know much about technology, but I know there's a subscribe button there somewhere. So go ahead and click that so you get the updates whenever I have a new video come out. Hopefully you'll get that, and you're going to want to keep touching in. This is one of the things that I discovered in my life, and that my students discovered and have repeated to me multiple times. You need to keep touching in. At first, oftentimes it's having a mentor, having a teacher who can help you to touch back in, that you've got to see on a regular basis, that kind of helps you to break your current pattern and get new momentum in a new direction. At some point, it becomes less and less necessary. Take advantage of me. I'm here. I'm available. Watch the videos. Share them with friends. If you need anybody, if you got anybody you know needs some help, and they're honestly interested in going to those uncomfortable places within that they haven't been willing to go until now, and they're willing to discuss it, contact@richardhaight.net. HAIGHT. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.